Hello, everyone. I am really excited to be doing this author conversation with Tara Sim. I have loved all of the books from ever since Timekeeper, and then through the entire Timekeeper series, and then with Scavenge, and now with these adult fantasy debut. So we're just going to chat about the City of Dusk, and I have a lot of questions about the City of Dusk. So we're going to chat about everything that I had to know basically when I finished the book. And just a general warning also, we don't tolerate any harassment of any kind. And so just like a general warning of that nature to not engage in that behavior. I'm Lily, and I'm the moderator conversation person. And I'm around the internet for Utopia State of Mind, which hopefully people will know if they're here. But anyway, I will let you introduce your book and maybe give like a little, summary, I guess, for everyone else.
Yeah, so I'm obviously Tara Sim. I am the formerly, YA and now adult author of fantasy books like the Timekeeper series, Scavenge the Stars, duology, and now the City of Dusk trilogy, which just the first book just came out like a couple weeks ago, which is wild to me. It's been great seeing everyone's reactions to it and falling in love with it. So that's been really fun. It's just to kind of like break it down to its simplest terms, it's multi POV epic fantasy, dark fantasy, of these four heirs from different houses descended from the gods. And so they each have these different powers connected to these different gods and these different realms where they came from. But these realms are now dying. And so now they kind of have to form a tenuous alliance to try to save their realm and possibly the other realms. And there's kind of like a who do you trust? Who do you not trust, people falling in and out of relationships and stuff like that. So all that good stuff going on.
Yeah, I love the who to trust and who to not trust. I feel like that's a good theme for the City of Dusk, or a good starting point. But so other people have mentioned in the chat already, and I also mentioned that I loved a lot of your previous books. Well, actually, all of your previous books. So I wanted to know what it was like to draft the City of Dusk versus your other books, which were YA books.
I mean, it's definitely true that every book is different. Like no matter what like the age category is, it's just always going to be different. So even my YA books, even books in the same series were completely different in terms of drafting. So like the Timekeeper series especially was very different for me because that's a lot of historical stuff going into it. So a lot of research, a lot of a lot of my editor telling me to go to etymology.com and telling me that certain words and phrases had not been used yet and stuff like that. So that was a big factor in drafting the Timekeeper series, is just all that research I had to do. And drafting Scavenge was also pretty interesting because that is a world that doesn't really have magic. Like it has alchemy, but I'm so used to like writing books with like magic that writing one without it was like kind of weird, not bad weird, but just kind of like, oh, this is like a little bit different. And then obviously with City of Dusk, there's so much magic. And it was really challenging because not only just because like it's adult and I have to have like all of these like details and lore and like world building and stuff, but also just in terms of making sure that the prose is suitable, I guess is the right word I'm saying for adult, because I grew up reading adult fantasy and I absolutely love adult fantasy, but I didn't want something that was like super slow and literary. Even though those types of books are great, it's not really what I wanted for my adult book. So I kind of did it a little bit more like faster paced while still trying to like keep this like adult like energy to it, but also kind of like a crossover upper YA energy mixed into it, if that makes sense. So it was pretty challenging, but there are some similarities, definitely some differences. and of course with the multi-POV elements was very difficult in this book, even though I have written multi-POV before, like Scavenge's Duel, Timekeeper trilogy ended up having 3. This is 7 points of view, and so it was a little bit more to juggle on my end.
When you originally came up with the City of Dusk, did you know that it was going to be 7, or did you just know that it was going to be more than 3?
I definitely thought that there were going to be at least 4, for at least 1 heir per. But I feel like I knew that it was just going to be like as many POVs as I could fit into it. um, Originally, actually, I think there were 8 POVs, and then I ended up having to cut one. Um, and that was Braylee, the youngest Lestrider's sibling. She originally had a slightly bigger role in the book that unfortunately had to be scaled down. It's still there a lot, and like I just had to kind of like repurpose them into Tasia's scenes. But yeah, definitely 7 was like the cap for me and my editor. She was like, "No more, please. We're good."
Another, this is giving me many like unscripted question ideas, but is the sequel also gonna be 7 POVs? Okay,
Yeah.
I just wanted to check if we were gonna get like an explosive kind of 8 more or whatever.
Oh my god, no. I think my poor editor would kill me.
Because this one, we were talking like you were talking before about crossover and also adult, age category. Because this was adult, were there any like specific elements that you could lean into more? I know you mentioned the pros, but was that like a conscious, decision when going into this one? Like, oh, I'm going to lean into, that element.
Yeah, definitely. I think prose wise for sure. I think I had more time to really dig into like descriptions and like there are like little pockets of literary prose here and there throughout the book, but like a lot of the character interactions are very like fast paced and funny and stuff like that. I'd say like the biggest component is probably world building. Like I love YA fantasy, but my biggest gripe with it is that there's not enough world building in these books. So I was really happy to dig in like extra hard with the City of Dusk and just kind of give more lore and more like background stuff, and to just take like an entire page just to kind of like slow down and explain past historical references and stuff like that, which is something that you can't really get away in YA. They're like, this is slowing the pacing down too much, take it out. But in adult, you can do that.
Yeah, the world building was also one of my favorite aspects. And I feel like the things you were, like the little, how do you describe it? Like the little references, I feel like, for even just books, right?
Mm-hmm.
The books that exist in the world. I feel like that felt, and maybe it's because this, this book is the most recent in my mind of yours, that like felt just super immersive, and the ways that it like something that seems kind of mundane can so easily root you in the feeling of setting, I guess, or like a feeling of otherworldliness.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
I'm curious, how many different drafts did you go through for the City of Dusk? Because I know you mentioned you deleted or like you removed kind of some of the POV. So
Right. This question gives me psychic damage because I went through quite a few drafts. I actually don't have like a final number. I should go through and like see if I can figure out a final number. But like it was so many drafts. It was a lot of drafts. Like just think of an inordinate amount of drafts, and it's probably more than that. Like it's so funny too because I think it was during like first pass page, between like first pass pages and like when the book came out, I kept thinking of like, I remember when this was part of the book and now it's no longer there. And, or like, I remember when this character actually did this instead. How funny that like, that was like 2 years ago now. Yeah. Editing this book was very difficult. Obviously it's multi-realm, multi-POV. There's a lot of magic systems, a lot of stuff going on. So it took a while of getting the book wrong before I could get it right. And thankfully my editor was very patient with me. I think there were times we were on the phone together, just like both crying, just because we were like, why isn't this thing working yet? But finally, through like some give and take, some compromises and stuff like that, like me taking out Braylee's POV, I think we finally, managed to get it into like a really good, like streamlined plot and, weaving the characters in and out of each other and stuff. And we both ended up very happy with how it came out. So I'm very proud of it, but also I don't want to recreate that process anytime soon.
Yeah, you mean you don't like name your drafts like version 1.2, version 1.
No, no.
Yeah. Is it hard to work while you're editing? Is it really, I find it, I've never edited anything for a reason. And I think one of the reasons would be that it must be really difficult to have all of these kind of like a palimpsest, or however you pronounce that word, basically, of like all of these different like versions of these characters in your mind.
Yeah. That did prove difficult from time to time, just because I feel like I'm good at revision, but there are some times where I can get stubborn about something. And so I definitely felt a little bit stubborn with like some stuff in this book in particular. And so I kept being like, this is the way it's got to be. I wrote it like this and I love it and it's great. This is the way it's got to be. And then when you write enough, you end up honing your instincts, and so that you end up knowing like in your gut what is right and what is wrong for the book. And I think there were some instances where my stubbornness kind of overrode that instinct, and led to some grief, unfortunately. But it all ended up fine. But it was because I was a little bit stubborn about a couple of things that it ended up kind of harming my ability to see like what else I could do with this thing that I wanted to keep. So like, for example, the end of Act 1 used to be very different. And I was very much liked how it was before, but then through some like brainstorming between me and my editor, we realized what would serve better as the end of Act 1, and which is what it is now. And I do like it a lot more. I think it flows much better, and helps with the character arcs a lot better. But it's tricky to be like, but I like this, I like it like this, and then kind of like having to be like, okay, well, I guess we can see how it goes, if I do it this other way instead, and then being like, oh yeah, I guess that works.
Do you feel like that stubbornness, or that character trait, do you think that would fall into any of the characters you wrote in the book?
Maybe. I definitely think each of the main characters has like a little something from me, and some of them are very stubborn. Like I don't consider myself even that much of a stubborn person, but when I can get stubborn about something, then I'm like, no, I want it like this. And I feel like Risha is pretty stubborn, especially like when it comes to like things should be like this, and then when they go off course, she's like, no, 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 no. And so I'm kind of like that a little bit. I think that's where she gets it from.
Oh, speaking of characters, we do have a question from someone. If you have a favorite character in this book?
That's so hard to say because I legitimately love all of them. Like I'd say like my favorite characters to write were Tasia and Angelica, just because they're very explosive. They're very fun. They have these like very big personalities, and I love writing about big personalities. And like I love Risha and Nick too. but I wouldn't call them like they're like a little quieter, you know what I mean? Like they're just a little more internal versus Tazy and Angelica, who are like, I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna do the thing, and it's like, yeah, do the thing. So I think they were my favorite to write for sure. I don't know, it's hard to pick favorites. Just it's like trying to choose a favorite child. I think I love them all in their own way.
Yeah. I think that question is really hard. It's like, what's your favorite book or something like that.
Mm.
I have a favorite, and my favorite is Tasia. But I will say that until I think Risha was my second favorite until Angelica does Redacted, and then Angelica became my second favorite, which I can't, I don't want to say, but I remember being like, I like this. I like what you did.
Yeah.
But anyway, that is Redacted. What happens?
That makes me really happy, actually, because I think I know exactly what you're talking about. That was actually one of the things that I was very stubborn about that I wanted to keep. My editor was like, "Are we sure we need this?" And I was like, "Yes."
I'm
So,
glad. I remember reading that because I was buddy reading this with like, or someone that I knew like had just read your book first, and then I was just reading it. And then I remember reading Redacted, and I like stopped and I picked up my phone. I was like, I just reacted, and I was like, oh my God, I got to this part. Like, I'm totally now in love with Angelica.
yes.
Yeah. And yeah. And so I was like, but when she did that, that was
Mhm.
when she like overtook Risha in my mind a little bit, I guess. um, I had a question about the series because I know you've written multiple series in the past, but I wanted to know. Always, I'm interested to know like when you're drafting a series, if you kind of think, when you get the world or like the story idea, if you kind of think of it and you already have kind of the ending point maybe, and then you have to like step it back, or like how do you balance kind of what will fit in a book? Because
Mm.
also City of Dusk is longer than some of your other books too, so you technically have more space, but I mean it's also like, as you were saying, when leaning more into the world and the prose and stuff like that, I feel like
Mm.
the pages maybe go by faster than one might expect.
Right. Um, I have had some comments like that too, where it's like this book is so big and yet it's already done. Like what? Like I'm already finished with it. What do I do now? Like sorry, originally it was a little bit longer, but my editor made me cut it. Yeah, writing series is very weird because I usually don't have the whole series ending in mind when starting it, um, or even like at the end of book one. Sometimes I don't even really know like what the actual like series ending is going to be. It's more of like I have a feeling for it, if that makes sense. Like I know emotionally where I want the characters to be, and I know kind of like the general state I want to leave the world in, but I don't know like the particulars. So like I'm not quite entirely sure like what exactly they're fighting against, or like who's going to die and stuff like that. Um so like in writing the Timekeeper series, for example, I actually thought Timekeeper was going to be a standalone. And then I finished the first book and I was like, no, there's a lot more going on here that I need to write out. Oh no. And so I didn't really know how that series was going to end until I was a decent way through book two, I think. And with this series, City of Dusk, I knew in general what I wanted from the series as a whole, and which is like a lot of like exploring and stuff like that, both in terms of character and world. um but I didn't really have a firm grasp of what I wanted that like final climactic thing to be until I was drafting book two recently. And then I was like I had kind of like an idea of like what I wanted out of it, but I wasn't quite sure like what exactly the building blocks were for it. And thankfully, because I am a discovery writer, which means that I kind of like discover things as I draft, I did discover enough building blocks to be like, okay, now it's taking more shape in my mind. I think I know how I want to like structure book three and stuff like that. And so it should it should be pretty epic is all I'll say.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, yeah, I think that the way that things end, I feel like would naturally lead into that kind of epic scale, I guess is how I will phrase that.
Yeah.
Um, I know you had earlier said that you cut or you removed some of Rayleigh's scenes, and kind of like tone, or not tone, but like, pared her character down a little bit. Were there any other kind of changes of that nature that you had in City of Dusk that you want to share? Otherwise, maybe you can't share them, but I didn't know if there were any that you could share.
Yeah, I don't want to, reveal too much of that because I have this fear that like readers will be like, but why wasn't that in the book? So I kind of like want to like keep a lot of that on the down low. But there was one thing that I was very sad to have changed, and it was in the very early drafts, like I don't know, drafts like 1 through 4 or something. uh I had this whole thing with Tasia where she was kind of like hanging out with thieves a lot. And there was like this whole like underground thief society type thing. And she was actually best friends with Kazuma. And they had a great friendship and I really loved it. And then unfortunately, because of where revisions took us, I had to kind of get rid of that friendship, which I think served Tasia's character a lot better. Um, but it still made me sad because I really liked them together. And so now, whenever they do still meet in the book, like they do have interactions in the book, but it kind of made me sad to kind of get rid of that little aspect of Tasia's story. But I think it works better without it for sure.
Yeah, and speaking of Tasia, my favorite character, how was writing her character evolution? Because I think that specifically, also within even just the scope of book one, I feel like the characters develop in such a complex and like really interesting way. Even in book one, obviously, I'm sure that like throughout the entire series, that will also develop. But I was really fascinated with Tasia's character evolution throughout the book, and so I wanted to know if there how her character was during drafting, or if you had specific influences or, inspirations for Tasia.
Mhm. Yeah, her character arc was a lot of fun, but also very difficult because she starts off very like selfish and very kind of like naive just because she herself is not the heir yet. Um, she mostly regards herself as like a spare. And so in her mind, that's her being like, oh, I can just goof off and do whatever because my brother's got it handled. It's fine. And then she realizes it's not fine. I have to step up. Oh no. And I really wanted her character arc in this regard to kind of reflect what it's like to grow up in your 20s. Because everyone has a different experience. But for me, I definitely had this like floundering period where I was like, I don't like, I'm considered an adult, but I'm not an adult. And I don't really know how to interact with the world around me, or like what to do. And like, hashtag adulting is hard and stuff like that. And so I kind of wanted to put some of those feelings into a character, and that character was Tasia. And so she obviously, there are all these other like external factors going on, like stuff with her brother and her family, and pressures that society is putting on her, that the monarchy is putting on her, and these stuff with like power dynamics and things that she just like really does not want to be any part of. Um, I just kind of wanted her to rebel against it in a way that I feel like a lot of us cannot. And so it usually ends up with her doing very like reckless, often violent things, which obviously I love and obviously readers love, but the characters within the story themselves are like, what are you doing? Because like I guess if we see like a hashtag girl boss like just like murking some dude on the street, I think we would all be a little off put. Like we would all be kind of like, that wasn't cool. But in the world of fiction, it's very cool. So I wanted her to kind of have this very like morally gray, like I want to do the right thing, but I don't really know how, and I don't really know like what to do, kind of like conundrum with her. And so I kind of built that up to its boiling point, and yeah, it was a lot of fun to write.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up her relationship with her brother as well, because I think that that's kind of the one of the main kind of stepping points to kind of go into that character evolution. There are a lot of complex sibling family stuff in the City of Dusk. I wanted to know. I know that it's hard to pick like a favorite because, as we've like covered earlier, that is kind of a cruel question. But like, were any of the siblings slash parent child relationships, were any of them specifically intriguing to you? That we were like, oh, I really want to focus on this because Tay and her relationship to Dante, like that was such a strong pull throughout there, and so that was the main one. But when I was kind of reflecting on the different families, specifically towards the end, there are a lot of things that are really kind of brought to a boiling point, I guess, in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. All of these families are very complicated and very different from each other, but they are all dysfunctional to some degree. Like obviously, I love the Striders because they're the family I focused on the most. The sibling dynamics I really loved exploring in book one, just because like I love how they're kind of like chaotic and loving, but then they have like this kind of like strict mother figure, and the dad's kind of like, oh, what's going on, that kind of thing. So I don't know, I really liked the Strider family a lot, but for like the other houses are also just very intriguing to me in different ways. Like I love Risha's connection with her sister, and how they kind of like, even though they kind of like poke and prod at each other, they are very supportive of one another, um, and kind of like dealing again with like this like strict like parental like overhead, and kind of like figuring out like, okay, how do we kind of like deal with that when we want to kind of do our own stuff. And the Mardovas are very interesting because there is a stepmother involved and stepsisters involved. And without giving too much away, I will say book two does dive into those relationships a lot more, which I was very like, I really wanted to have more of them in book one, but there just wasn't like really space. You'll definitely get more of it in book two. And then the Sear family, oh boy, is just a big hot mess. There's definitely some parental abuse with the Sear house. Unfortunately, there's a lot of grief in that house, and as somebody who has had a household go through a lot of grief, I thought it was, but not like that. I did want to explore like a household that was just continually going through this cycle of grief. So they're all, very interesting in their own regard. But if I did have to pick a favorite to write, it would be those Striders. They're just fun.
Yeah, I love the idea of getting more into like specifically the other family characters we might not see, especially in the first one, because I think that we're talking about character evolution, but obviously the characters within their family develop a lot in the way that they view themselves, and also I guess the way that they're like willing to be viewed, or putting up, I guess, to be viewed, I feel like changes throughout the book.
Mm-hmm.
Which will have ripple effects, obviously, within the family. Did you have a favorite side character?
Yes. My favorite side character is Paris. Excuse me. He is a hunter. He's partnered with one of the other POV characters named Julian, and I just really loved him a lot. Like He was just he had like a great voice, and he always like jumped out at me at whenever I was doing a Julian scene with him in it. I really loved working with his voice, and his character was just really really fun to dig in. And yeah, like he's not like a very complicated character at all, but like I just really loved his voice so much, and so he's probably always going to be my favorite side character from book one.
Was it harder to write any of the heirs specifically, or like was one of them more difficult to write?
I think they all had pros and cons, I think like personality wise, I got them pretty early on, but in terms of like character arcs and stuff, it was a lot more difficult. I'd say like in terms of like character arcs, Angelica's was pretty difficult because hers kind of like shifted and changed a little bit as we revised. And Nick's was also kind of difficult because like, again, shifting and whatnot. And there's like a lot of I wouldn't say secrets, but there are like some mysteries to be solved, like surrounding Nick's character arc. And so kind of like threading those through his scenes was took a little bit more of like a deft hand than with the other heirs. So I'd say those two for sure were a little bit more difficult.
Yeah. Speaking of Angelica, who is my second fave, we talked a little bit about Tay's like influences or inspirations. Do you also have like insight into Angelica's inspirations? Because I felt like her development or her character arc to me resonated so much, specifically at the end, but also throughout, like about kind of power and our quest for power / ambitions. So I felt like that was like the thing that really resonated the most with me. And I was wondering if you had specific kind of inspirations or influences for Angelica's character arc.
For sure. This is going to sound a little bit weird to say at first, but like I think with Angelica, just as like with Tasia, I wanted to kind of embody this weird, almost like millennial-esque feeling of like, what do I do? With Angelica, I really wanted to kind of capture this feeling of like needing to break away from what your family expects of you, which I think is a very like, how do I say this? Like, it's a problem that I think a lot of children of like immigrants have, if that makes sense. Like, there's this feeling of like, your parents will put a lot of pressure on you to like do well, or they, saying that they just like, want you to be happy and stuff like that. But also like they kind of have their own like thoughts of like what they want for you. And so she's kind of dealing with that as she goes through, while also kind of figuring out like, okay, what is my idea of power and what do I want? And is it more about what I want versus something I need? Like, do I need power, and is it okay to want power and to want strength? And so she's dealing with a mother who's very like controlling and just very, wants her to, to be perfect. And she's under so much pressure to be perfect, and knowing full well that she is extremely flawed. And so for her, like her whole overarching arc in the whole series is to learn to be okay with who she is, basically. And it's going to be a struggle for her, my poor girl. But I definitely wanted to kind of like embody that feeling of being like, this is like, I'm ambitious, I want these things, but I also want them to not be the things that other people want for me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, which is why I thought that like the foil or Tasia and Angelica's relationship, I think like you're hitting on, or one of the things I was thinking about is ambition related to both of them, because you're talking about how Tasia is like the spare heir, or the spare, and like doesn't have the same ambition, I guess, that Angelica has. And so I thought that their relationship or their tension between each other perhaps maybe boils down to some of the some of the things that we're talking about in relation to how they view maybe their future and like the power, their power in the future.
Absolutely. I loved writing the two of them together whenever they were in the same room, just because they just do not like each other. They have like so much disdain for one another. And it's exactly because of that. It's because Angelica thinks that, Tasia is just like kind of a waste of space. Like she doesn't take things seriously. And meanwhile, Tasia over here is thinking Angelica takes things way too seriously and needs to like calm down. And so they just kind of continually butt heads.
Yeah. I want to pivot a little bit to the world building because that was also one of my favorite elements. And I wanted to know how you started creating this world, or like what was the first world building wise kind of idea or seed that was planted for you?
It's actually kind of hard to go back to like the origins just because this book has been in my head for over a decade. So it's kind of difficult to remember where certain things came from. I know that it began with the thought of the four different houses. That was the very first thing that came to me, was having these four noble houses all descended from the same line of monarchy. And so then they're all in contention for the crown. That was like the number one first thing that came to me. And I didn't really do anything with it for a long time until eventually I kind of, had the thought of like, oh, well, each of them, needs to be different in some way. So each of them will have a different power. But where do these powers come from? Maybe they're different gods that can be, associated with them. And then maybe there's all these different realms. And so I think like from that one seed, everything just kind of expanded out from there. But it's a little bit hard to like think about what the exact influences were. I think it's just something that just kind of like came out of nowhere and hit me in the head.
I also wanted to know, because we were talking about how you could lean more into the lore and like the specific history. So I wanted to know how you approached balancing like when to lean into it and when to kind of step back.
Mm-hmm. That was definitely something that I think needed to be refined in revision, because there were times where, like, especially when you're writing a first draft or something, you just kind of have to like dump things. And so there were like a lot of info dumps here and there that me and my editor scaled back on, and or like, oh, this information can actually be put over here instead. And then there were some instances where I was like, well, you're just going to get a little bit of an info dump, whether you like it or not, like just because this is the best place to put this information. Because I like to tackle like exposition and stuff like that in terms of what does the reader need to know right now in order to make everything else within this scene have better context. And so that's kind of what informs me putting what and where. So for example, there was this like page of lore where Angelica is going to the basilica to see her god, and there's like this whole page backstory of basically like the founder of her house and how he became the founder of their house. And it didn't really have like a huge like influence, I guess, like on the scene, but it's like stuff that I as a reader I think would be really cool to like read about and learn. And so as an author I put it in there because I was like, hey, this is pretty cool. And so just like kind of adding these little like lore bits here and there to kind of give you, I think, more appreciation for like what you're about to witness in the upcoming scene or something like that was fun to do.
Yeah, I love this idea of like what do you need to know at that specific time period. I think there were some moments that are also redacted, but there are some moments where I felt like it was such a perfect melding of kind of like, oh, you see this, and of course it's like this is what happens, which isn't something organically you might have thought about earlier, but like when you're confronted with it,
Mm-hmm.
then you think about it. Speaking of world building, but also Risha's magic was probably my favorite. So I wanted to know if we want basically, I only knew about like the bone magic kind of thing before I read the book. And that's still one of the main reasons, or one of the many reasons that I really love this book. I wanted to know if you have favorite bone magic books, or like what your inspiration, or, how you dove into that kind of
Mm-hmm.
basically everything bone magic, like everything, all of that.
Everything bone magic. I love it. Yeah, I've always been a big fan of necromancy. It's a weird thing to say out loud, but like hopefully you know what I mean. Um, like I love just like bone magic and like spirit communications and like spooky stuff and ghosts and things of that nature. Not so much zombies for some reason, but uh, and so I definitely wanted to write a book where a character has the power of necromancy, and so I wanted it to be not like the standard type of necromancy, if that makes sense. Like I wanted to have like a little bit of like a spin on it, so it wasn't just like, you know, pretty like cut and paste type necromancy of like, oh, I raised someone from the dead. Like, no, like what are the spells in order to do that? Like, even though, you know, the Vakara family are the only people who can do that, like, and so it's kind of like in their blood, like there has to be something else, some sort of like conduit for them to do that. And so I thought of this idea of making almost kind of like runes, or like ways of like crafting their spells, such as like with the string. And so like some spells they can do just kind of like a little bit of like a thing in the air, which I feel like is very anime, but so they can do that sometimes. Um, and then with certain other spells, they need string if the spells are like more complicated. So they kind of almost do like a solo version of like Cat's Cradle type thing, where it's like they kind of like do the string spell system. Like for example, if she's trying to get rid of a spirit, in order to bind it, she kind of like attaches it like to that string almost, and then breaks it, and that's how the spirit departs. So I wanted something a lot more unique to necromancy, and that's kind of how I found it.
Yeah, I loved that connection with the string, specifically the first instance with binding of spirits. I felt like
Mm-hmm.
that was a really cool like play, I guess, on the idea of binding and like string.
Mm-hmm.
So that was also something I was thinking about as well, like the rule system to magic, and also specifically for necromancy, but also for all of the magic. I mean, there's definite senses of what you can do and what you can't do, and maybe what you shouldn't do.
Mm-hmm.
How do you approach thinking about magic, but also like, okay, but this is something that you can't do, you know?
Yeah. I like to approach magic with the sense of like I need some sort of restriction on it, right? Because otherwise the characters would just go hog wild with their magic. So there needs to be some restriction to it. So like for example, there is a scene where Risha just gets too overloaded with stuff and ends up fainting because she just used too much of her energy. So there has to be like a hard limit, right? But I don't like the thought of magic being too restricted, if that makes sense, which is I guess kind of where the secret fifth magic comes in with conjuration, because when conjuration comes into the scene in the book, everyone is freaking out because they're like, what is this? Like, how are you doing this? You can't be doing this. So the conjurers kind of like replicate necromancy through this kind of like alchemic like circles and stuff like that, that was used to like summon demons and stuff. So it's very much frowned upon. And so you see a lot of characters kind of discussing like how magic should be used versus like, why can't we use it this way? Like you can't like put rules on magic. Like magic should be for whoever wants to use it. And so it's kind of like, it's almost kind of like a bloodline versus common type of theme going on there, with like who can use magic, who's allowed to use magic, who deserves to use magic, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that because as you were saying that, that was the first thing I thought about. Yeah, this idea of like inherited
Mhm.
magical ability versus the kind of like I know that obvious. I think when I think of their rituals, I think of it differently than it's actually presented. But then they're summoning circular things
Mhm.
is all I'm gonna say. Because I know in my mind I'm envisioning something that is not actually it, but that's just like what I first go to when I think of like, oh, we're gonna summon a demon, and this is what it's gonna look like.
Yeah.
Um, when you thought of the houses and the heirs, did you
Mhm.
already know what their magical powers were gonna be, or did you like have to figure that out as you go?
I definitely did not know at first. I like this is the thing that I was saying before. Like I don't really remember when I found out or like how I assigned it to different people. Like I knew very early on that there was going to be shadow and light magic. Um, like I had an image of Tasia and Nick with their little familiars, their little like light and shadow familiars, and I was like, yeah, that's the thing. And I think the other two were a bit more. I think I had to think about it a little bit more, and then with the Vicars, I'm like, oh, necromancy. Like it would be really cool to have like an Indian family that's like does necromancy. That's like incredibly my jam. And then I think when I was thinking of like what the different realms should be and what realm they live in, I was like, what would constitute as like life magic? Oh, the elements, duh. And so I think it kind of went in like that order of thinking of who was going to have which type of magic.
Yeah, there was a definite poetic or balance I feel like that you really develop with Tay and Nick's like
Mm.
light and shadow
Mhm.
um exchange.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I just wanted to remind people to drop questions. We have already some, but I will ask one more final question for me.
Mm.
And I wanted to know about battle scenes
Mm.
because I felt like you have some really great ones that take on varying um, variety of battle scene
Mhm.
or fighting scene. And
Mhm.
so I wanted to know what it was like to kind of envision these scenes. And also, is this something you've always been good at?
I like to think so. Yeah, I really like action scenes. I love battle scenes. Um, and I think my editor was like, at some point in the revision process, she was like, "There's a lot of action. Let's maybe scale back and do like a little bit more of like a quiet scene here and there." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." I mean, obviously she was right. Um, because like I was saying before that the ending of Act One used to be pretty different. It used to be like a lot more action centered, and then it had to change to something quieter. And I was like, no, I like the action, I like the violence, blah blah. But obviously, it was the correct choice to pivot to what it is now, um, and just kind of have like a steady like build up of chaos and action as the book goes on. Um, I think I've always been drawn to action scenes because I tend to envision them, I think, in my head pretty well. Usually my go-to tactic for kind of like imagining battle scenes and whatnot is to put on some like epic music scores and then just kind of like pace around while thinking of like what's the coolest move this person can do. um, and I think I get a lot of influence from like anime and video games and stuff like that are just very like action centric. I think that just kind of naturally like trickles into the stuff that I like to write. And so when I listen to certain types of music, I tend to envision these big set pieces and these big movements from the characters. And so um, even before I drafted the book, I would listen to these songs that reminded me of what the final battle was going to be in book one. And so I had images in my head that are now in the book that I had in my head for like at least 5 years because of the different music that I would listen to and stuff. So I think I think that's always been kind of like a natural part of my writing, is just throwing in all of these really cool like action set pieces.
So one question that we have is, what are some of your biggest inspirations / favorite books / authors?
Well, from like way back in the day when I was first getting into fantasy, Tamara Pierce was very, very big influence on Small Tara. It made me love swords and fantasy, and especially girls with swords and being badass. And then when I was a little bit older, like in middle school, I discovered Lord of the Rings, and that was around when the movies were coming out. And that was a very huge influence in me becoming a writer, because I looked at this giant world and cast that he had created, and I was like, this is so cool. And it's making me feel a lot of things. I want to do that too. And, I wrote my first book at 15 because I just like loved reading all of these like big, fantasy books and stuff like Wheel of Time and whatnot. And we didn't really have that many like YA books back then. This was like way before like the huge boom. And then when I was like a little bit older and trying to like get into publishing and stuff like that, I feel like authors like V.E. Schwab in particular were tackling these kind of like themes that I really liked. And like when A Darker Shade of Magic came out, that was like, it was one of those books where I was like, oh, this was written for me, for me specifically, because it was like this awesome like crossover type story that I just absolutely ate up. And I was like, I want 10 million more of these. And so that kind of influenced how, I ended up writing like stuff like City of Dusk, where it's like I wanted more of like a crossover feel to it. And yeah, there are definitely, other authors, like more recent authors like R.F. Kuang and stuff like that, who, Tamsin Muir, who like, even though I don't really write like them, I like aspire to be as good as them, if that makes sense.
Another question that we have is, what is a scene or chapter you're most proud of writing, or was the most challenging to write but most rewarding to see?
Honestly, I think like the entire climax of book one was it was difficult, but it was fun at the same time, just because, like I said before, I had so many images and stuff in my head of how I wanted this to play out. But then, of course, when you actually get there, it's like, oh, it can't actually just be all cool fight sequences. Like, it has to have, it's the ending of the book. Like, I have to have all these character arcs and like plot threads coming together. And so I was like, oh God, oh no, logic. So that part of the climax was pretty difficult. And it was actually, it did change, like the whole, like I'd say like the core of it in several moments from it stayed the same throughout drafts, but the kind of like setting for it kind of changed a little bit, and some of the stuff going on kind of changed. And so figuring out how to provide like a really like big satisfying ending was stressful, but also very satisfying, and I'm really happy with how it turned out.
Speaking, because you reminded me with the Lord of the Rings thing, do you have any, like, would you ever be interested in putting together basically just like a book or a collection of just lore for the City of Dusk, like, a history behind it? Because I feel like I'm pretty sure that that's something that he did, right? Like he,
The Silmarillion, yeah. Yeah, this is I call a Silmarillion basically the Middle Earth Bible because that's what it is. It's like all of their like creation stories and stuff. It is something that I've like thought about of just doing like random little like short stories here and there of figures from their pasts and like the guy who wrote the grimoire and stuff like that, just like or like the former kings or whatever, or like what life was like before the sealing. Like I think it would be really cool to kind of put together a collection like that. I do have a novella idea that would be like a prequel sort of thing that actually like would tie into something in this series. So I don't know, we'll see. Can't say much more than that, but
That would be really, really cool. It would
mm-hmm.
be really, yeah, like almost like notable characters from the past. And yeah, I would love to read like short stories in depth about even just the past heirs, and like all
Yeah.
of their
I think like
conflicts.
especially doing one where like the last house, which I think is Vakara, like getting founded, and then the uneasiness like between the four houses, like and their founding and stuff like that, I think would be really interesting to delve into. So I don't know. We'll see what my editor says later.
Yeah, there's interest for it.
That's good to know.
You need to pass that on to certain interested parties. Um, I want to ask, because we were talking about inspirations and favorite books and stuff like that. And I wanted to know also, what are some books, films, TV shows, any media thing that you would recommend for readers until book 2?
Well, I definitely think Getting the Ninth would be perfect. um, Other stuff like other kind of crossover stuff like Darker Shade of Magic and the Poppy War, for sure. This isn't really related to City of Dusk, but I've kind of been obsessed with Our Flag Means Death on HBO Max. Fantastic show. I highly recommend it. I've also just been really, like, ever since the Panini started, I've been really into The Untamed, which is on Netflix. So it's like a Chinese drama that also has elements of like necromancy and different clans being very having tensions between them and war and magic and stuff like that. So yeah, that's what I would recommend.
How do you think that Risha would get along in Gideon the Ninth?
Not great. I think if she was in that position, she would be very sad. I feel like she would try to get along with like Harrow, and just be spurned like immediately. But I feel like there are some similarities between Tasia and Gideon, so I feel like Risha would find an unexpected ally in Gideon.
Yeah, and I also feel like there's a kind of investigative quality to Gideon the Ninth that I
Yeah.
feel like Risha could do. Like, I feel like there's similar vibes of investigation and like mystery unraveling, I guess, that has to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like she wouldn't be like too far, at least for that element.
She could definitely hold her own, but in terms of like interacting with the other characters, I think she'd be like, oh no.
Do you have any other favorite necromancy books or like necromancy stuff? I'm also obsessed with necromancy, so in the best way possible. Um, that's what I'm asking.
I mean, definitely The Untamed, and the book that it comes from. I'm trying to think of. Oh, I think you had asked me earlier about like bone magic. It's not necromancy, but there is a great YA series called The Merciful Crow. It's a duology, and the main character uses teeth as a form of using magic. So basically, she can use the powers of whoever had those teeth, which is just such a cool magic system, and I love it so much. So that's definitely a bone magic system book that I would recommend.
Yeah, I feel like I was trying to think about what my answer would be if I asked myself this one. I feel like I recently read The Bone Orchard, which I
Mm.
feel like has obviously there is the word bone in it,
Mhm.
but I wouldn't say it's a very, as you were saying earlier, like a copy paste kind of thing. I really think that it's very, has elements that one might be like, oh, that's like bone magic slash necromancy stuff, but is not what you might expect. So I feel
Mm.
like that would be interesting.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, I would just basically read like a whole bunch of necromancy things. I agree with you too, though. I'm not a big fan of like zombies or kind of
Mhm.
like undead, if you want, if you know, if that's what we call them.
Mhm.
But I do also really love the way that you integrated bone magic and fashion and like all of that that whole interchange or like that whole scene thing gave me very much of like a Hunger Games kind of entrance vibe.
Yeah. I do love that scene a lot for sure.
Yeah. I think that was one that I was like, yep, this is the vibe I'm getting, and I really love that.
My editor very much wanted me to make sure that all of the heirs' outfits were described immaculately in that scene. So I was like, I got you.
Yeah, no, that was what some of the things that we were talking about earlier, right? Like a detail that
Mhm.
felt very, it's not necessarily essential to the story, but
Mhm.
it so firmly kind of roots you in like, oh, this is the standards of, what people are expecting. This is the thing that, sets the bar, I guess, for the spectators, right? Like
Yeah.
this is the norm
Yeah.
for everyone else.
Mm.
Thank you so much for chatting all about the City of Dusk. And thank you to everyone who joined. I hope that I have the links for the City of Dusk in the description if I have done my job right, which was a very small job in comparison to writing a book. But I hope that I've done that part right. Um, and I hope that everyone enjoyed. Please go pick up the City of Dusk. It's a great series starter, also, and then you can like just wallow with me while we wait for book two and read
It's written
everything.
at least.
Thank you all for joining, and I hope that everyone has a really great rest of their day, night, rest of your waking hours, I guess. All right. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.